So, you've made it to part 4. Well done. So this is it. This is the final installment in my 4-part series on the great debate between Matt Dillahunty and Matt Slick. And, God, I make that sound good. I'm just gonna come right out and say it. This last video is gonna have very, very little to do with the actual debate that took place on the Atheist Experience show. Basically, I'm using this opportunity as an excuse to add one more fallacy to the list. I think Matt Dillahunty sort of made it a point, whether you think he followed through enough or not, he tried to illustrate as many fallacies as he could in Matt's argument, and I think he missed one, and so I'm going to add one more. In Matt's original YouTube video, in which he articulated the transcendental argument for the existence of God, he said the following: concepts reside in the mind, and thoughts reflect a mind. Since we have absolute and transcendent logical truths which are conceptual by nature, it is logical to conclude that there is an absolute and transcendent mind that has authored these absolutes. I call this absolute and transcendent mind God. Just a side note, by the way, Matt has participated in several debates in which he is very adamant about the fact that God did not author these absolutes. They just happen to be a product of his nature. So he's blatantly contradicting himself here, and I don't exactly know why. But anyway, back to the point. The syllogism that Matt is getting at here would look like this. Laws of logic are transcendent. Laws of logic are absolute. Laws of logic are conceptual, or of the mind. Therefore, the mind that laws of logic are of must be transcendent and absolute. This is called a fallacy of division. The fallacy of division occurs when one tries to conclude logically that something true of a thing must also be true of all or some of its elements. So an example of the fallacy of division might be commercial airliners can fly unaided across the ocean. Commercial airliners can travel very fast. Commercial airliners have a jet engine. Therefore, the jet engine of a commercial airliner can fly unaided across the ocean and travel very fast. Clearly, the conclusion here is false. But the structure of this fallacy is exactly the structure of Matt's argument. Take a look again. Laws of logic are transcendent. Laws of logic are absolute. Laws of logic are conceived by a mind. Therefore, the mind conceiving of laws of logic is transcendent and absolute. The conclusion here is false for the exact same reason as the airliner example. It does not follow that because a mind conceives of something, that mind has to possess the same properties as the thing it's conceiving of. That's ridiculous. Matt has not demonstrated that a subjective mind cannot conceive of and assume the truth of an absolute transcendent concept. Why couldn't it? I mean, according to Matt's reasoning, we should also conclude that only a tasty and fattening mind can conceive of chocolate cake. And fallacy of division aside, it should be clear that Matt's conclusion is false simply because we can observe its negation every day. I mean, Matt wants us to know that he starts from logic and works his way toward God. He doesn't assume the truth of God. He starts with what we know about logic and logical absolutes. Well, every time Matt uses logic and his non-absolute, non-transcendent mind successfully conceives of these absolute transcendent concepts, he falsifies his conclusion. What does Matt have to say about that? I mean, would Matt try to argue that he's not actually conceiving of logical absolutes? Well, then how is he using them? I mean, surely he must be able to conceive of them if he's using them. Or would Matt try to argue that he's able to use them only because God conceives of them? Well, then why? God and Matt don't share the same mind, or does Matt think that we're all inside God's mind? How exactly does that work? I mean, and this is important because even if we grant all of Matt's unfounded assertions and premises, what Matt is trying to argue is basically that logical absolutes are the product of thinking, but we have finite subjective minds, and logical absolutes are perfect, so we can't think them. So, Matt argues, somebody must be thinking them, and that's God. Well, how does that help? If God is conceiving of these transcendent absolute concepts with his transcendent absolute mind, then the transcendent absolute concepts are still in God's mind, not outside of it. So to be interacting with these absolutes, to be affected by these absolutes, we either have to be inside God's mind, or God has to somehow make these concepts manifest outside of his mind. Both of these, by the way, are stunningly problematic for the Christian worldview. Saying we're all inside God's mind is a can of worms Christians do not want to open. I could have a field day pointing out the problems with that. Or does Matt believe that God somehow made these conceptual absolutes from his mind manifest outside of his mind and into actuality? Well, if this is the case, then I could ask Matt, right now, the same question that he asked Dillahunty. What is the nature of their existence, then? They aren't simply conceptual because they exist outside of God's mind. Are they physical, then? Well, clearly not. That hasn't changed. Well, if they aren't conceptual by nature, and they aren't physical by nature, what are they? What is Matt's third option? Would Matt say that they are spiritual by nature? I don't know, I can only assume so, but there are a couple of problems with that. One is that, just like Dillahunty's third option, Matt can't give an account of what spiritual does mean, only what it does not mean. He doesn't know the substance of which spiritual entities are composed. He doesn't know the mechanisms by which spiritual entities operate. He only knows that spiritual entities are not physical and they're not conceptual. In other words, the only difference between Matt's version of a third option and Dillahunty's is that Matt slaps a label on his. That's it. And consequently, this raises an important question about God. Namely, what is the nature of his existence? Physical, conceptual, or other, which presumably Matt would call spiritual. And the reason I ask is Matt brought up an interesting point in the debate, in the actual debate with Dillahunty. Here's a direct quote. He said, "How can you know what something is not if you don't first know what it is?" Indeed, Matt. How can you know that God is not physical or conceptual if you don't first know what spiritual is? There's a double standard going on here. Either Matt has to recant his criticism of Dillahunty's third option, or Matt must concede that he cannot know for sure that God isn't merely physical or conceptual, either of which would be devastating for Christianity as a system. Here's another quote from Matt, taken from his own radio show the day after his debate with Dillahunty. He says, "I do believe very firmly that if someone makes an assertion about something, they need to demonstrate the assertion to be valid. Now, if someone's going to assert that there's a third option to the nature of logical absolutes, then demonstrate what that third is. If you can't do it, forget it." So, according to his own reasoning, if Matt is going to assert that there's a third option for the nature of God, then he must demonstrate what that third is. If he can't do it, forget it.